It is Oxford, so we need to have an Oxford debate. My task is just to introduce the moderator of the debate, to Pilita Clark from the Financial Times. But before I do that, I'd just like to say that the proposition that this House believes that tackling climate change is good for global equality is a meaty one, and you shouldn't necessarily assume that everybody is arguing for the side that they actually personally believe in, which makes it quite enjoyable. I often think that more of us should spend more of our time arguing the opposite of our prior beliefs. So I leave that thought with you, but I'm simply going to introduce Pilita, who's a super friend of the Smith School. She's a business fellow at the Smith School, but mainly she is associate editor and business columnist at the Financial Times, where she's been writing a weekly column, which I'm sure many of you read, I certainly do, on corporate life and a range of other exciting things. She's been covering environment and climate and aviation and the environment for, actually I shouldn't say a very long time, but let me give precise dates, since 2003. So Pilita, thanks for your support. Thanks to the FT for being our media sponsor, and I'm certainly very much looking forward to the debate. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Cameron. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I think I'm right in saying that this is the first time that the Forum has had a debate. So a new addition to the Forum, one that I heartily approve of. We are, of course, as you all know, just a short stroll away from the Oxford Union, where people have been debating all manner of things, from membership of the EU to whether we should go and live on Mars, to the rise of hookup culture. Very pleased that today we are going to be debating a motion which has kind of come up in some ways in the earlier discussions today. Some of the themes I think we may hear being repeated, but really the idea that this House believes that tackling climate change is good for global equality is, as Cameron says, a little bit trickier than it may first appear. We won't be using all of the Oxford Union's rules. We will be having an audience vote before and after, and I'll be explaining shortly how you will be able to vote. But first of all, I'd like to introduce our two absolutely brilliant teams, and huge kudos to the Smith School for organising these teams. So speaking for the motion, we have Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, who's the founder and chief executive of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, which is a think tank, very esteemed think tank. Arunabha has also been an advisor to an array of governments and UN environmental processes, everything from the Montreal Protocol to the Paris Agreement, and most recently, an extremely influential UN report on corporate net zero targets. The second speaker for the motion is going to be Charlotte Wargniez, who is a student at the Smith School, where she's doing one of the exceedingly sought-after Master of Science degrees in Sustainability, Enterprise and the Environment. Charlotte's already done an HBSc at the University of Toronto, and she's now a research assistant at the School of Geography and the Environment. The final speaker for the motion will be Suzi Kerr, who's chief economist at the Environmental Defence Fund, which is one of the largest and most influential environmental campaign groups in the US. Suzi has done extremely important climate work for many, many years. She helped to create the New Zealand emissions trading scheme, and she's advised several governments on carbon market design. Speaking against the motion, we have, first of all, Emma Pinchbeck, who is the chief executive of the energy trade body Energy UK, which represents large generators, suppliers, all manner of energy companies. If you listen to the Today Show, I'm sure you already will have heard Emma speak. Before she joined Energy UK, Emma was at the deputy chief executive at Renewable UK and previously head of climate change at WWF UK. Second speaker is Alexis McGivern, who is Net Zero Standards Manager at Oxford Net Zero Research Initiative here in Oxford. She also runs a training program for 4,500 climate justice activists, and she was previously at the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which publishes the very well-known Red List of threatened species. And third on the against team is Asad Rehman, who is the Executive Director of War on Want, which is a group that campaigns to end poverty and injustice. And Asad was previously head of the international climate at Friends of the Earth. He served on boards including Amnesty International UK, Global Justice Now, just to name two of them. Okay, so these are our two teams. The rules are that each member of the team will be speaking for 8 minutes in turn, starting with a representative from the for team. They will then have 4 minutes at the end to make some very brief closing remarks and to rebut what the other team has said. As I said, before we start though, we are going to take a vote, and we're going to be using Slido, which I'm sure is an app or it's a website that you will be familiar with. If you point your phones at that QR code, I have tried this myself, it does work, you will come up with the question that you're going to be asked to vote on, which is tackling climate change good for global equality? You can see a few phones still up, so I'm just going to wait for everybody to pull it up. Anybody having trouble? Hands up, no trouble? Okay. Vote away if you believe that tackling climate change is good for global equality. Please tick yes. If you don't, please tick no. We will shortly have a big reveal, but not quite yet. Just a few more seconds. We're dangerously close to running on time, which is astonishing, but there we go. Okay, has anybody still waiting to vote? Okay, I think we can now see what the answer is. Oh, 78%, okay, what a surprise. Okay, well, that means it's time for the debate to start. So 78% for. Arunabha, you are the first speaker. Let's see how you do in confirming that 78%. Please welcome our first speaker for the motion, Arunabha Ghosh. Thank you.
Oops. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me here. The last time I did an Oxford debate, I think it was 20 years ago. The planet, I won't tell you how the debate went, but the planet was definitely less warm, but the world was definitely more united. So can we now focus on climate action in a manner that we also deliver a world that is more united, more equitable? And I'm here to suggest that we can. We are dealing with a world where, on one hand, countries and people are having to handle a challenge of debt and development, and on the other hand, a challenge of disaster and decarbonization. More than 50 countries across the world are heavily indebted, which reduces their capacity to act on a range of sustainable development goals. Only a fifth of the SDGs, which are meant to be achieved by 2030, are on track. And therefore, how does a country or how does a community handle that level of indebtedness and crisis, a here and now crisis, while also living in a year which happens to be the hottest on record, which has had wildfires from Hawaii all the way to Asia? How does that economy then also deliver opportunities that make us more resilient against the disasters, but also make us participate in the world of decarbonization? I'm going to suggest to you that we can do that in 3 ways. That climate action can, on one hand, bridge the development divide between countries. That climate action can bridge the economic opportunity divide between economies, and that climate action can bridge the justice divide between people. Just a few weeks ago, when the G20 Leaders Summit occurred, with the world's most prosperous economies and the fastest growing economies coming together, there was a recommitment to the SDGs. But more importantly, there was what was called a Green Development Pact. A pact, a covenant, not an international treaty, not a negotiation, but a pact that suggested that green and development can go together. Let's take 2 examples then. When these SDGs were announced in 2015, India, my country, had the largest number of people without access to electricity. Over the last 2 decades, about 700 million people have got access to electricity in India. Over the remainder of this decade, 700 million people in the world have to get access to electricity. Bridging this energy access divide, which can drive a range of other climate and sustainable development outcomes, is part of that Green Development Pact. But then there's another part of that pact, which is about finance. And if we can drive climate action in a manner that delivers finance, then we can deliver the equity that is missing. Unfortunately, I'll be the first to say that money does not flow where the sun shines the most. When I started CEEW in 2010, none of the top 10 countries with solar capacity were in the tropics. And yet, since then, India has deployed 70,000 megawatts of solar capacity, 42,000 megawatts of wind capacity. And yet, if we look across the world, all of Africa gets less than 3% of clean energy investment. So acting on climate means acting in the geographies where infrastructure is needed. And that infrastructure has to be sustainable, and for that to happen, finance has to flow. The trillions of dollars that need to flow to the billions of people in the global south. But bridging this development divide by focusing on clean energy, not just by SDG 13, but SDG 7, SDG 6 on water, which then helps to drive outcomes on gender, on public health, and on education, perhaps creates the foundations of sustainable development and human development. But I would propose to you that we can also then bridge the economic opportunity divide. When we think of the energy transition and climate action, we are faced with a triple challenge of money, which I've talked about, manpower, and materials. But is there a way to overcome this by having a different mantra of jobs, growth, and sustainability? Less than 1% of the global workforce is in the fossil fuel extraction sector. And yet, when we think about the just transition, we focus on the few, ignoring the many that could benefit from a completely different model of development. The challenge is not going to be easy, just because I've quoted some percentages. In India, again, 13 million people are dependent in some way or the other on coal-led industries. And yet we know that there is the potential of 50 million net new jobs through India's net zero transition. Across the developing world, we see that potential in Vietnam or Malaysia as exporters of solar PV panels, in Indonesia or Colombia as large parts of sustainable agricultural value chains, including biofuels, and of course in sub-Saharan Africa, if we bridged not just the development divide, but the economic opportunity divide by focusing on the kind of value addition that we derive or can be delivered in these geographies, especially when it comes to critical minerals. But then that leaves us with a justice divide. And can we truly overcome a justice divide by acting on climate? 74 lowest income countries will be most affected by climate change. But going back to my first D of debt, the challenge with a changing climate, a challenge with disaster, is not just you're hit by storms and floods and droughts, but that the percentage of one's GDP that gets impacted is far higher in low middle income and least developed countries. Investing in early warning systems, as was discussed just last week at the UN Secretary General's Climate Ambition Summit, actually, 1 minute left, right? Actually allows us to save billions of dollars in losses and thousands of lives. Investing, for instance, about $2 trillion in adaptation and resilience over this decade could generate over $7 trillion in global net benefits. But it's not just about increasing resilience. It's also about powering livelihoods. Bridging the justice divide requires us taking the energy transition closer to people. The 37 million livelihoods that could be mobilized in India alone using distributed clean energy for rural livelihoods. As I conclude, then let me simply propose to you that climate action alone is not going to work, but climate action to deliver on the development divide, on the economic opportunity divide, and the justice divide by putting people at the heart of it all, can deliver a just outcome. Climate change is only the second greatest crisis facing humanity. The greatest crisis facing humanity is a lack of empathy, a lack of understanding of people of other colors, cultures, genders, and geographies. It's that bridge that we have to cross. I rest my case.
Thank you so much, Arunabha. Beautifully timed, I have to say. Okay, the first speaker against the motion will be Emma Pinchbeck. Thank you.
It's already going brilliantly well. As if that poll wasn't good enough. There's something about being back in Oxford that just unhinges me, which is good news for the team. Our contention, I think you're going to hear a lot of the same arguments from both teams. The difference between the two teams is one of can or could, and will and is. And my job here is to tell you a little bit about what the private sector is doing. And the reason for that is basically where we have made gains in terms of tackling climate change. It has almost entirely been about mitigation, and that mitigation has almost entirely been delivered by the private sector and technology development. And I work for the private sector, so unusually I'm here to tell you all the things that they are bad at. First up, I think it's really good, many of you, I suspect, from the suits work in the private sector, and there is something great about private industry in this space. We think long term, we plan for 20 years, unlike governments. The IEA and the IPCC is very clear that that is the reason that the curve is bending, if it is at all. And actually, industry innovates, and often innovates faster than the state has predicted. So the costs of renewables have fallen faster by factors of 10 relative to what the state predicted. And I can see Ben Rimington, the UK civil servant, in the room, and I vividly remember being told that offshore wind would only be £100 megawatt hour in 2020, and it's now below 50, maybe a bit more at the moment. However, you're going to hear from the rest of the team about why mitigation in itself is an unfairness, and the focus on it from the private sector is also unequal. There are $3 trillion of private capital circulating in the world. We struggle to get it into mitigation projects, but even so, that money is not going to move into adaptation or into loss and damage with anywhere near the same ease. The reason is simple. Whilst business understands that adaptation is a punt against risk, it still basically appears on the balance sheet as a cost. And loss and damage is just a cost as far as business is concerned in our current framework. Inside current frameworks, those things are not going to get financed, and that's where a lot of the global inequity sits, just as in international negotiations. I would also argue that the focus on growth in models requires that we miss some bolder actions and actions that could bring forward emissions reduction more quickly. That's because we're obligated to think about pathways as the least cost. That is the only way they would get through government. We are obligated to think about pathways that continue the business model as we know it. We are obligated to think about people losing jobs if we change incumbent companies, sectors of the economy changing, and the disruption of that shift. And therefore, even the UK world-leading carbon budgets only model a 50% likelihood of meeting that 1.5 degree target. Anything bolder is politically untenable, and certainly untenable in the current economic model. Profit, which is the motivator of my sector, feels obvious to say this aloud, is not something that incentivizes social good. Our job as industry is to make money, and we pursue technologies and business models and outcomes that will prioritize profit above other things. That is why sub-Saharan Africa does not have solar, even though it's sunnier than much of the global north, all of the global north. That is why tech rollout inside countries like this one prioritizes middle class and wealthy customers first. You probably all have iPhones in your pocket. I remember when those came out, because I was probably in a room like this one, and the only students that could afford them were the very wealthy ones, and we all waited until the market socialized them and made that cheap. I don't think that's a particularly just way of doing technology rollout if we were to design it, but it is the way that the market will deliver it. There are inequities in that business model because of us pursuing profit above social outcomes. And that will happen for EVs, it will happen for clean heat, if you leave it to the market or profit or growth or GDP or existing models to drive the change. The other thing I'm not supposed to say out loud, because it drives the climate skeptics to my Twitter, is that all infrastructure has an environmental and social cost. And this is an infrastructure challenge of the kind we haven't seen for 100 years. We are building an enormous amount of kit, all of which involves concrete, all of which involves minerals, all of which involves local impacts. There is often a trade-off between local unfairness and national fairness, and it is a trade-off. If you're thinking about the world that I'm in the UK, where we have a world-leading renewables market, in my time in the job, I've dealt with things like offshore workers' wages and whether it's fair that we pay maritime wages to workers on offshore rigs because they move all around the world and that's what they get paid everywhere, instead of, for example, the UK minimum wage. I've had conversations about unionisation, less unionisation in renewables in the traditional energy sector. I've had conversations about minerals. There are fewer minerals in an EV than there are in an ICE vehicle, but they are different minerals from more vulnerable parts of the world, like the Congo or the DRC. We're having conversations about the unfairness of geopolitics. If you're in Taiwan right now, the fact that you make all the world's superconductors and the best microchips in the world is something to consider when the two biggest global powers, China and the US, are now after that market. This is just in my day job. There are also within country the trade-offs between local and national benefits. If we build pylons in East Anglia and substations in East Anglia because that is where the wind is and renewables are innately geographic, what does that mean for those communities if the only answer we give them is this is better for everyone's bills? Is that actually truly equal, or should they receive more money and a bigger share of the benefits, and how do we fund that? Less bad, for me, is not the answer, but it's often the one that we give. And even when I think about the measures that the industry is taking, recycling wind turbine blades, extending battery lives, battery reuse, circular economy models, the fact that profit is still our primary motivating factor means that those things are as much about resource efficiency as they are businesses truly asking what is fair or what is just. Jobs were mentioned then, and so if I look at the world and the jobs that we're creating, there is also an unfairness and some unspoken things in that world. We will create more jobs for the green economy, but they are likely to be in the same places for the same communities as the fossil fuel industry has been. We saw what happened with coal, and without active effort, there will be unfairnesses as we transition communities away from fossil and into these clean technologies. I think about Aberdeen all of the time in the UK, and there are equivalents all around the world. Equally, no offence to my industry, but 85% of you are still white men, and I have been working for 10 years in the sector and not seen much change in that regard, despite all the language about renewables being a more altruistic, better, more ambitious, caring industry. The reason that is a problem is the workforce tends to design infrastructure in its own image, and coming back to the fact this is an infrastructure challenge, we will create the same inequalities in our future economy as we did in the last. If you've ever tried to move a baby around the tube, you will know that infrastructure designed by men to get men to work does not favour women, or indeed other voices. I mean, I suppose to finish, having run through all the list of things about what the problems are, okay, well, what could we do to fix it? There are two things that move business and move the economy. One is public pressure. And we've talked a bit about mitigation, but the other side of the coin, and territorial emissions, I suppose, is the other side of the coin to that is consumption. And we should be clear that consumption is going up in the global north. The public say they care about climate change, but are flying more than ever, and they are buying SUVs. Business can do something about that, but it is a much bigger civil society effort and a communications effort. And do we think that is possible in today's politics? And looking at Ben here, the last frame is government. I'm in this job because I think we can do it better. We all agree that we can do it better. The skepticism from our team is, will we do it better? Because governments have not yet sought to act in this space. And just to finish, I believe in the human capacity for empathy. I have 2 children. My daughter is extraordinary in the innate care that she has for her brother and other people. But does she need good rules to become a good citizen? Absolutely. Am I sure that governments are going to provide that? No, I am not. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. Okay, second speaker for the motion will be Charlotte. 8 minutes is yours, Charlotte, starting almost now.
Hello, everyone. I'll start off with a simple question because I'm a simple student. What is climate change? Now, firstly and correctly, this is a straightforward answer. It's the change in the world climate patterns, or some might also view it as just the amount of greenhouse gases associated with those changes, a simple parts per million number. Tackling climate change is good for global equality. Wow. I was in Thailand when I received this topic, and naturally I shared it with my best friend, an astrophysicist from Bangkok. And he couldn't understand why climate change and equality was even in the same sentence. And trust me, it wasn't just because his head was in the stars. But he was right. With a simple yet incomplete definition of what climate change is, it was easy to overlook what the problem is and pick the wrong side. So in an effort to enlighten the opposing team, and the 22% of you, let's paint a bigger and better picture of what climate change entails. And what we'll soon come to realize is that climate change is unforgivable, but foremost, it is unfair. And that not taking action can result in an increased mortality, poverty, and economic breakdown in the long term. Challenges which are far greater threats than what the opposing team would suggest as the waste products of tackling climate change, such as switching to a carbon economy. So when we associate some of the most cutting-edge research on climate change with economic and non-economic measures of inequality, the results are frightening. And that's why, even though mitigation might not be ideal, it might not be perfect, and especially in the private sector, but the question is not about if, but it's about when we should be tackling climate change. Let's take, for example, the three main economic sectors. Talk about agriculture, energy, and tourism. In terms of agriculture, climate change is associated with warmer temperatures, okay, straightforward, which in countries like Canada and Northern Europe could result in longer growing seasons for vegetables. But now what were we talking about in lower latitudes, where most of the countries tend to be the less developed? Temperatures are now exceeding crop optimum temperatures and causing lower yields and also physiological damages. It also goes beyond just about average temperatures going up. We're talking also about climate change affecting the amounts of droughts going on, increasing the water stress. In South Asia, where agriculture represents 22% of the regional gross domestic products and employs almost 60% of the labor force, it is predicted that the annual average daily temperature can increase by up to 2.6 degrees Celsius just by half of the century in 2050. And thus heat stress in the region could be increased by 21%. Projections also claim that almost half of the Indo-Gangetic Plains, which is the major food source for Southeast Asia, could be completely inappropriate for wheat production by 2050. Now, the impacts of climate change, not just the stress, are also mostly felt in the lower income countries in agriculture because one, a bigger portion of their economy relies on agriculture, and two, they have less adequate equipment to actually combat those stresses that are going to be felt. Now, if we move on to the energy sector, higher mean temperatures, once again, there's a recurring theme here, mean that on average, the world will need more space cooling to sustain indoor temperatures to a comfortable and healthy level. Now, the way the current energy supply chain is currently structured makes it highly vulnerable to climate change, not just by increasing the demand, but, for example, we're seeing at the production level, a lot of the energy today requires water for example, nuclear energy, but also natural gas refining. And if we look at the water stress, which again is a product of climate change, then that means that we have more water stress and more stress on the energy production side. It doesn't stop there. If we're talking about energy transmission, so extreme weather events currently have also had an impact on the transmission networks, especially in developing countries where transmission networks and the resources at hand to protect them from those challenges are less robust. For example, in January 2022, massive power outages caused by a historic heat wave in Buenos Aires, Argentina, affected nearly 700,000 people alone. And another example, on the other side of the spectrum, in November 2020, freezing rain caused coated power lines in the far east of the Russian Federation, leaving hundreds of thousands of homes without electricity for several days, further increasing energy poverty in vulnerable countries. And finally, tourism. Pre-COVID, the IPCC report showed evidence for countries in the tropics and global south, where tourism provides their main economic activity, have already shown to be vulnerable to exceedingly warm temperatures. Small island developing states, for example, can represent up where their one quarter of their GDP, and at least 7 of those is due to tourism, and most of their economic growth can be thanks to tourism. They also face an increasing risk due to degrading coral reefs and an increase in cyclone activity. Now, complex systems have complex problems, and we live in a complex world. That's why there are direct and indirect costs to climate change. If human conditions worsen, for example, then performances lessen, communities are less resilient, and ultimately reflect in economic losses. So, for example, some of those have shown to increase mortality due to higher temperatures, especially cases of heat shock in pre-existing cardiovascular and respiratory diseases patients, especially increased after 32 degrees Celsius. Most regions projected to experience consecutive extreme heat days are in Central Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America. In fact, the New York Times created a NICE website where you can track the amount of days in your hometown that have reached these extreme hot days of over 32 degrees compared to when you're born to now to projections in the end of the century. So I played around with that website because I thought it was great, and I decided for the sake of science to be 63 years old. And when I compared my hometown, Paris, with my friends in Bangkok, you could see that in 1960, Paris could expect only one day a year to reach above 32 degrees Celsius. Today, it's around 3, and in 2100, we would expect about 9 very hot days a year. Now, let's compare this with Bangkok. 1960, there were 185 very hot days, naturally, latitudes. But today, it experiences about 264, and by the end of the century, we would expect Bangkok to experience at least 314 very hot days. That's 214% Paris's increase in very hot days. So, and that's just talking about climate stress in terms of heat. We're not regarding in terms of the technologies at hand to keep people cool, and we're also not talking about the healthcare systems in place. So it's all about thinking about it systematically. Studies have also shown that climate change is related to infectious diseases due to high thermal preferences of vector-borne diseases, and also new studies in psychology show that there can be GDP losses due to lower cognitive performances. So there's something inherently incoherent with the new picture that we painted. And my physics friend, who would remember the first law of Newton by heart, wouldn't understand why not taking an action can result in such drastic reactions. But that's why climate change is unforgivable, but foremost, it is unfair, attacking the most vulnerable and breaking economic barriers, geographical barriers, and what even may seem like physical principles. Taking action and relying on new technologies, new economic flows, and shifting our goals from development to such things as SDGs provides the direction we need to narrow the economic and human development gaps. If we do not take action, conditions are to worsen, efforts against inequality are going to be dampened at best, and that is why tackling climate change is not only good, but it is necessary for global inequality. That's it.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. We will now hear from our second speaker from the team speaking against the motion, Alexis McGibbon. Thank you, Alexis. 8 minutes starting now.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to be here today. My opposition have already given compelling arguments that tackling climate change is good for global equality. Now, since we are outside the halls of the Oxford Union, I'm going to start off by breaking 2 forms of debate convention. The first is that I'm going to state all the things that I agree with my teammates on. We agree that there is a moral obligation to act on climate change. We agree that climate change poses the greatest threat to those with the least responsibility: the global south or global majority countries, low-income peoples and disadvantaged peoples, women and intersex people, marginalized ethnic groups, and queer people. And thirdly, there are clear win-wins to addressing the linked crises of inequality and climate change. These include, for example, the fact that manual laborers are increasingly vulnerable from excessive heat and humidity, to Charlotte's point, and in the US, occupational heat-related mortality is 35 times higher among agricultural workers than any other industry. There are also tertiary health consequences that are affected by climate change, including conflict, forced migration, and famine, all which deepen poverty traps within vulnerable countries. And indeed, many climate technology and solutions come with co-benefits that are built in. For example, we look a lot at the triple benefits of moving from traditional cook stoves to more efficient ones in terms of forest preservation, improved health outcomes, and time savings for households. And yet, I am going to break convention a second time by saying I'd like to change the motion to the fact that climate change is not necessarily good for tackling global equality. The necessarily is important because how we solve climate change is just as important as the fact that we solve climate change. Without careful consideration of the solutions that we are implementing, we risk baking in the exact same inequalities into our new world. If we take it as a given that solving climate change automatically addresses inequality, we risk putting blinders on the unintended consequences of our actions. To add to what my honourable colleague Emma has already said, I'd like to bring in 3 key ideas that it is not necessarily true that tackling climate change is good for global equality. These focus on 3 things: power, process, and people. The first, power. Where is power being concentrated when we think about tackling climate change? Research from the Smith School's very own Sam Fankhauser and colleagues have shown that the global patents for inventions related to climate adaptation, 2/3 of them are held in just 5 countries: China, Germany, Japan, South Korea, and the United States. These include technologies like water desalination, air quality improvement, and others. This data, which came through the World Patent Statistical Database, shows that, quote, virtually no transfer of the relevant patented knowledge is to low-income countries. When we think about tackling climate change, where is that power and wealth being distributed? And where is power being concentrated as we roll out our global climate solutions? The second point is on process, that solving climate change depends on fair representation as we roll out our solutions. Whose voices matter in building this new world, and tackling climate change cannot inherently tackle global inequality if it does not represent all voices and opinions. If we look at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is our global architecture for handling climate issues, there are so many inequalities baked into that system, from very practical pieces, such as delegation size. At COP27 last year, the United States brought a delegation of approximately 300 people, which allowed them to be in every single negotiation room across every single agenda item. It also allowed a roving cycle of people who were extremely well-rested, well, that's maybe an exaggeration, and ready to negotiate. In comparison, small countries are there with small delegations that need to cover their ministries of environment back home and follow several negotiation items at the negotiations. This is called negotiation by exhaustion and often leads to outcomes favoring the most powerful countries. And therefore, our climate solutions in that space reflect the inequality of our existing world. Research from the International Institute of Environment and Development also show that queer people are excluded from climate action, from finance and from formal networks. They're also completely unheard in policy design. So how can we expect to deliver fair climate solutions when we're excluding such a significant portion of the population? My colleague talked about just transition, and we cannot have a just transition without free, prior, and informed consent, which is something that doesn't often happen in communities around the world. Just transition speaks to not leaving people behind and instead empowering workers and communities and ensuring that we don't replicate patterns of low pay, poor conditions, and precarious work in our new world. I'll note that in the UK, Scotland has had the Just Transition Commission, which has done really careful and thoughtful work on what a just transition partnership would look like in Scotland, and that has not extended to any of the other devolved governments, England being most large in the UK, United Kingdom. The third is on people, and that tackling inequality means tackling inequality for all, not just shifting the zones of where inequality happens. I'm going to quote from one of my favorite people, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who recently spoke at the climate march in New York City, speaking to 75,000 demonstrators who were asking for the end to fossil fuels to be fast, fair, and forever. She said, "What we're not going to do is go from oil barons to solar barons." There are concerns legitimately raised about renewable energy rollout with regards to access to energy and to land, and the amount of land grabs and human rights violations that are happening as a result of renewable energy rollout. In India, at COP26, there was a pledge made to roll out and increase the amount of renewable energy, which has then been linked to a large acquisition of land, mostly from poor rural title holders. And this is not unique to India. In the Hebei province in China, a new PV project the developers were accused of forcibly removing people from their lands. And the London-based Business and Human Rights Resource Centre tracked 197 human rights violations of solar, wind, bioenergy, and hydropower projects between 2010 and 2020. And the same, of course, goes for carbon markets, a most contentious climate solution that has been accused by the Clean Development Mechanism has been accused of not only not furthering emissions reductions, but secondly, being involved in the forced eviction and the human rights violations of land defenders. So as we discuss this important topic, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be with you all here today to discuss it, and knowing that we all sit somewhere along the spectrum of climate action being both urgent and necessary, I just want to emphasize that solving climate change inherently alone does not bring us close enough to a more equal world, and that we need to ensure fair inclusion and fair prior and informed consent across all of our projects, as well as inclusion of all peoples, especially those most vulnerable, in order to ensure that our move to a greener and fairer future go hand in hand with a more equal world. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alexis. Now, our third and final speaker for the motion is Suzi. Thank you, Suzi. You have 8 minutes starting now.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm going to make 3 basic arguments. The first is that climate change exacerbates inequality. Second, that if we are going to have effective global climate action and collaboration, that will necessarily advance global equity. And third, that how we act really will matter for effectiveness and equality. And I would note that to win the debate, we don't need to show that climate action will lead to a perfect, equal world. I wish it would. But we need to show that it is better for equality if we take action than if we don't take action. So first, climate change itself exacerbates inequality. My partner in crime here has done an excellent job of laying that out. Essentially, climate change disproportionately affects the poor and the vulnerable, and it will massively set back development. They live in the worst places, and they have the least ability to adapt. So just to add a little bit more to what she already said, there's a climate action lab, a climate lab at University of Chicago have done empirical work that suggests that the mortality rate from extreme heat will hardly change in rich countries as a result of climate change. But under business as usual climate change, it will rise by 144 people deaths per year per 100,000 people in poor countries. And if we can limit climate change to 2 degrees, we could lower that death rate in poor countries by 78%. So hard to argue that that wouldn't be good for equality. So I would also note that the debate is about the word is good for global equality. Not that it will be perfect for global equality or that it will be good for equality even in the future. I've been working on climate change now for 30 years, and some days I feel that I've failed, but looking on the positive side, we have innovation that we never would have had if people hadn't been working on this problem focused on climate change. Renewable energy. We're putting up a methane satellite so that oil companies will now be able to see where they're releasing methane into the environment. Many, many other innovations, and I'm sure there are a lot here at Oxford too. We are beginning to see policies that are bending the curve in some countries. So although we haven't done nearly enough, it's not good enough what we've done, we are doing some things that are good, and that means that that's good for equality too. So I would argue QE do here, but I'm going to continue. So second, effective global climate action and collaboration will necessarily advance global equity. And I would argue this following on from, in some ways, what Arunabha said. Modelling from the EU suggests that in 2030, if we are on a cost-effective track to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees, 75% of the mitigation will be happening in developing countries. That mitigation is not going to happen unless we transfer resources. And by resources, I'm talking about capital, grants, carbon payments, concessional loans, debt forgiveness, but also transfer of technology and skills and capability and access to markets for clean products. We won't do any of those perfectly, but if we're going to make progress and we're going to achieve even some of our goals, we're going to be transferring resources to people who really need it. And I'm hearing that in this meeting today. Conversations about how do we overcome the barriers to moving capital to emerging markets. Conversations that I was not hearing 10 or 20 years ago. And I'm confident that the brains in this room will make at least some of that happen. And all of that brings real benefits to the countries where those resources land. One of the really critical parts of that mitigation over the next 10 years is renewable expansion. About 50% of the mitigation options are in decarbonisation of electricity. And again, as Arunabha said, there are 750 million people without electricity at all. The combination of the innovation and the pressure to decarbonise our electricity grids gives us an unprecedented opportunity to expand renewables to those people, avoiding maybe 600,000 cases of malaria a year, lifting 1.3 billion people out of poverty. And with particular benefits to women, who have to spend enormous amounts of time walking to get fuel, wood and water. This will give them time for education, for income generation, and to do the job they really want to do on childcare. And renewables are combined with electrification of industries, and that brings air quality. So a Chinese Academy of Sciences study showed that the improvements in air quality in their cities as a result of closing coal and increasingly rolling out EVs, has been saving millions of lives in recent years. And that's happening now. It wasn't just about climate action, but it's part of their wider climate program. And protecting tropical forests is 10% of the mitigation options that are coming, that are needed. Those tropical forests are home for Indigenous people. They really want to have them protected, and they are taking increasing leadership roles to do that. It protects against flood and drought. It provides cultural, social, and economic values. So none of this is going to be feasible if we try to keep all the gains in the OECD. We will be forced to share some of that benefit with other countries. And third, how we act matters. So I've argued that only climate action that drives development will actually work. And we all agree that developed countries and high-income people have a moral obligation to help those who are less disadvantaged. But I would also argue that success will rely on some empowerment of groups who are currently disempowered. So climate change, unlike other problems we've faced in the past, is terrifically complex, involves every aspect of our economy, of our society, of our cultures, and it requires decentralised decision-making. So decentralised decision-making can only be done by the people on the ground, and so we will have to provide more empowerment for those people. An example of how that is actually working is in the Amazon, where there's a group called Koika, who are a collaboration of Amazonian tribes, and they are very actively working with companies through the Leaf Coalition to try to get better control over their land. They don't want their land to be cleared, but they need help. And they need essentially to be given more control in order to protect it. So in closing, climate change is itself the greatest threat to global equality. So taking action is, and I would argue will, improve global equality. The movement of resources and empowerment of people is key to that success. And finally, I'd argue that taking climate action gives us all hope everywhere in the world, and that is a critical part of our well-being. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzi. Well, our third and final speaker from the team speaking against is Assad, and we are zooming along here, I have to say.
I've got a few more minutes.
I'm still only going to give you 8 minutes, though, starting from now.
So I'm a northerner, so I might try and speak fast to get as much in. I was reminded as I was sitting there, the words of Greta Thunberg, when she famously said, "We are telling ourselves bedtime stories to lull ourselves to sleep, and we have to have enough of this blah, blah, blah." So we are not dealing with issues of should, could, or grasping for some empty claims, because it warms our hearts. I think here today is this discussion, like climate science, should be rooted in empirical facts and in empirical realities. We all know we're standing on the edge of an ecosystem collapse, of a planetary crisis, of a crisis of inequality, of climate violence. We know that scientists have said that we're leaving the Holocene period when human civilization, as we know it, has flourished, and in the words of the Secretary General, now entering an era of global boiling. So if we don't have an answer to the question, how did we get here, then how do we avoid replicating the same injustice of inequality and injustice that are baked into our economic and political system? And there's a reason why those on the front lines of the crisis have always coined the word system change, not climate change. Because as we're all aware, we've known about the science of climate change for, about 100 years. The scientific models, we've known about them for like at least 50 years, about its impacts. We even signed a binding treaty 30 years ago, and we're currently heading not to a warming of 1.5 degrees, but according to Professor Kevin Anderson of the Tyndall Centre at Manchester University, we're heading towards between 3 to 4 degree warming, not the 1 degree that was demanded by the Global South in 2007, and that was rejected by European Union, US, and the rich countries. The reality, of course, as we know, is that the past shapes the present and it determines the future. Dr. Ghosh eloquently stated we have a crisis of empathy, but it's not just lack of empathy in abstract. Actually, we have a system that is designed to do something. And if we had time, I would say we have to go back to the doctrine of discovery, which codified a racial hierarchy of black, brown, poor, indigenous, and women, and legalized the notion of exploitation and extraction of resources and people. And that's been played through from slavery, colonialism, imperialism, to our current reality and the current dogma of neoliberalism. The idea of sacrifice zones and the deliberate impoverishment of the global south has been the cornerstone of our system and of our policies as they are set out. So we have to ask ourselves, how is it that the richest 10%, all of us are sitting in this room, we own 76% of global wealth, and the poorest own only 2% of global wealth? That same poorest 50% who not only lack clean cooking, electricity, social protection, public services, but are currently earning the equivalent of $5.50 a day. We know that 2 billion people face hunger issues, 1 billion people without access to water. Now, this isn't an accident. This is deliberate. And those who are shaping our policy solutions today are the same top 1% who have benefited from that same economic model. As Audre Lorde said, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So I want to talk about some facts. The carbon budget. So, because some people reduce this whole conversation simply to a matter about carbon. So even if you took a simple carbon lens, right, because that is the cornerstone of what current climate policy. Is it, let's talk about fair shares, historical responsibility. If you took the G8 countries together, they're currently responsible for about 85% of excess global emissions. You took the global north as a whole, 92%. Did the rich countries meet their pre-2020 climate targets? No, they didn't. Are they doing their fair share of the 2030 targets? No, they've adopted this deadly, dangerous, and frankly inequitable net zero 2050 goal, aiming to consume more than their fair share of the carbon budget and making the poorest pay the heaviest price. And as we've seen this week, the US, the UK, Australia, Canada, planning on a massive expansion of new oil and gas, 51% of all global. So the question about, yes, we might see more renewable energy, but of course the dominant form of fossil fuel industry in the global north is continuing. That economic cost of inequitable colonization of the carbon budget, it's been estimated. It's a whopping $172 trillion. If you took wealth and resources that have been extracted from the global south, From 1960 to present day, that's another 152 trillion. Are we having any conversation about returning some of those resources to enable people in the global south to tackle those inequality? Of course not. We stood here in Oxford where the very bricks and mortars of these grand buildings flow from the ill-gained profits of slavery. And I'm also from the Indian subcontinent, and I know well when the UK came and visited us for a few hundred years, it left our GDP from 24% to less than 4% and took home 38 trillion pounds to finance its own economy. Look, if you simply, that's not just about historical, it's in the climate mitigation models, the pathways in the IPCC, all but one developed in the global north. All of them allow the global north to continue to pollute. All of them rely on unproven technologies to suck carbon out of the atmosphere, and there might very well be people here who genuinely believe in CCS. It's not proven. The only technology that is viable, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, relies on a landmass of 2 to 3 times the continent of India. Whose land will be taken? Whose land? Ours? No, of course it will be the poorest in the world. Can we overcome that inequality divide when the very economic models that are the cornerstone of all climate policy are predicated on unjust energy consumption of the global north and the global south? If you look at those climate models, by 2050, per capita income in sub-Saharan Africa is meant to grow from $1,000 to $3,000. In the global north, $35,000 to $69,000. It's built in, this inequity and injustice. And if we look at finance, you know, we talk about the amount of money that's needed. 6 trillion, the UNFCCC says pre-2030, 4 trillion for clean energy. Well, in 2009, we had a promise of 100 billion. Less than a third of that is being met. Just this last week, we had an Africa Climate Summit. You know, a continent which has faced famines and floods, 800 million people without access to energy, a continent which is only responsible for 3% of historical emissions. Did they discuss adaptation? Did they discuss loss and damage? No. An agenda shaped by the United States and McKinsey said it's all about mitigation, it's all about carbon markets, so that the rich can pollute and rely on those who pollute less to be able to cut their emissions for them. We talk about renewable energy. There's no finance and technologies on the table. We talk about all of these industrial strategies of the global north. They're all about controlling the global economy and controlling resources. I want to say, of course, that, you know, I can hear words already. Oh, we must be pragmatic. We must live within this system. Of course, living within this system is a luxury only for those who are not already dying from the system. And that is the reality of this inequitable system. Now, the IPCC, when it released its report, AR6, said, change is now inevitable. The only question is who will be pay the price. And the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, when he wrote, well, we've created a climate apartheid where the rich will use their wealth to seek safety and leave the poor to burn and drown, is the reality of climate crisis. And I want to end by just saying, there is a reality, because we've just seen it in the last 2 years, right, of a COVID pandemic in real time, right? We were told by our G7 leaders, if you remember, no one is safe until we're all safe. And what did we do? We competed with poorer countries for PPE equipment 4 times more than what we needed. When the public health systems of the global south were collapsing because of those debt repayments, because we'd hollowed out their health systems, we told them to get more debt-creating loans. When taxpayer research funded the vaccine and global south countries said, let's have the vaccine, we said, no, we're going to put patents on them and allow big pharmaceutical companies to make $1 million per second and allow 5.5 million people in the global south to die unnecessarily. That's the reality of climate policy.
Thank you very, very much. Wow. Fortunately, I don't have to sum this up right away, because we now are going to go to the rebuttal period. And because you've all been so brilliant at sticking to time, I'm going to give you 6 minutes each. Oh no, or sharp intake of breath. All right.
No, it's like, I can't believe we're on time.
I'm going to give each team 6 minutes each to respond to the points made in the opposing team. And we are going to turn to the 4 team first. And so I'm going to start very very soon to put the timer on for whoever would like to go and speak first. You have 6 minutes starting from now to rebut. Thank you. Suzi.
So I'm going to take a leaf out of the Against Thames book and start with what we agree with. And we agree that the current world is grossly unfair and that that is not acceptable. And we agree that current climate action is not being done in an equitable way, and there are a lot of moves afoot that are not helping to do that. Things like the CBAM is putting really disproportionate pressure on countries like India and South Africa. We agree that empathy is a problem. I've always liked Mark Carney's Mark Carney's sort of categorizations of different tragedies, and I think we actually face an extra tragedy, which is the tragedy of distance. Most of us simply cannot imagine what it is like to live in the global south and to live in poverty. And so although we might be empathetic towards people we know, which is what we've evolved to do, we're not able to really think ourselves into the head of people we've never seen. But all of those things which are terrible are not a reason to stop taking climate action. They are an argument for doing better in how we do climate action. And unlike in colonial times, when there was a terrible extractive and exploitative system, and that has continued, in this instance, we in the North have to solve this problem too, because we can hide our bunkers, but that is not the lives we want to live. So success for our own well-being, the well-being of our families and our children, depends on us helping those in the South to address this problem too. So I think this is a unique opportunity to force the North to actually think about the interests of the South in a really deep way, if we will take it.
I think I can't reiterate what Dr. Kerr just said. We agree on a lot of things, and especially I would agree on the opposition team to say that it has been unfair for the Global South in terms of their economy and potentially the associated halt, the short-term halt, in the economic development of the Global South due to tackling, as we call, mitigating climate change. But as the IPCC report in 2022 just released, the long-term goals, what about the long-term trends? And in the long term, not taking action, focusing on development only, and not taking action in actually mitigating the impacts of climate change in the Global South result in economic losses that far outweigh the short-term economic growth that we might currently see. So, sure, for current presidents, for current politicians, it might not be in their favor to think only in the long term and not see the economic growth they can take into account now. But I think, and that's the only thing I will say, is the reminder of the long-term trends, and that taking action is not about just thinking right now. It's about taking what our next generation will endure, and that tackling climate change can also mean growing in a smart and better way in the Global South. Leaving it to you.
Talking about the next generation, the other day my daughter, who's just 10 and a half, said, Baba, we are doing these SDGs this time, so this is the second time round, right? So what happened previously? I said, there was the MDGs. So we achieved the MDGs. I said, no, we didn't. The problem with the MDGs, it didn't focus on inequality. And the whole point about acting on climate change is that you cannot act on climate change without focusing on the inequities. I agree with the three challenges that the opposition has put forward: the concentration of technologies, the concentration of voices, and the concentration of private incentives. But there's a different way. In order to act on climate change, we have to not receive technology, we have to co-develop technologies. In my hand is a block not of green steel, but a block of green brass made by small businesses in India. In order to change the voices who are setting the rules, we have to look at climate change as an opportunity for not concentrated but decentralized and distributed markets. And in order to change the private sector incentives, I simply want to say, if you want to make money, come home. Come to my house, because I'm offering an investment opportunity of over $500 billion this decade alone. We've got to stop thinking of people as the objects of our largesse and more as the subjects of the change that they desire. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Arunabha. Now, the team speaking against the motion now has 6 minutes to rebut. And Emma, you're going to go first?
I think I'm going to try and...
You're looking as though you are.
Right.
Okay, 6 minutes starting from now.
We thought, for no other reason than to promise you that we're all singing from the same hymn sheet, I would do the comments for the whole team, though they may heckle me. Fundamentally, the question about tackling climate change hasn't been one about equality, and that is why you're hearing so much from our esteemed colleagues on the other team about could and if rather than will and are. I thought Suzi was interesting because you said we should judge the world as it is. And I have lived through the last 10 years of the energy transition, and we've achieved more than we thought was possible in my sector. I talked about it. It's remarkable. Frankly, sometimes it's the only reason I get out of bed in the morning, having worked on climate change. But in that time, global inequality has grown. We have delivered in the UK a third of the electricity mix as renewables. We have done that whilst growing the economy, but our society in the UK is more unequal than it has ever been. The gap between the richest and the poorest citizens have grown. You can deliver an energy transition, you can deliver emissions reduction and mitigation, you can grow your economy and do things differently, but you do not necessarily get a more equal society, and you do not necessarily correct the injustices of the past. I thought it was so interesting, Suzi, that you talked about that, see the world as it is, and then the rest of your argument was about we could do this, and it will happen, but I couldn't see the tools to actually get us there. The second thing that I think we've talked about, actually, and this is especially for Asad, the other thing to note is that no one can agree whose responsibility that is, by the way. At international level, the IPCC has said the equity point, the just transition, that is a job for national governments. I don't know if you heard the Prime Minister's speech last week, but we have just pushed back our climate targets in the UK, and slowing down that trajectory will cost poorer people more money. Slowing down EV deployment actually means that the poorest don't get access to second-hand vehicles. Slowing down our progress overall adds additional costs to the economies, costs that will be borne by the poorest. National governments are not taking responsibility for this. And speaking for business, we are motivated by profit. We are not social enterprises. Tell us why it's our job to correct the inadequacies of our international or national governments. Hope is not enough either. I love this quote from civil society. It's a famous quote, "Hope is not an aspiration. It should be a bloody tool we use to batter down doors." It's not enough to say we could do this, we should do this, society will improve. If you want equity as an outcome, we have to measure it. And that means GDP is not an effective measure for the economy because that prioritizes growth at all costs in a world that is finite. It probably means that growth is not a sensible metric for business, because what does that say about circular economy models? Enough being enough, redistribution of benefits, something that is fairer for society. Profit is not enough because it means we don't pursue social outcomes. And the models that drive climate mitigation in of themselves bake in intergenerational and historic inequities and assume a status quo. And arguably, that is not enough if what you're pursuing is equality rather than emissions reduction, or equality and emissions reduction. To pick examples from colleagues, just because you have an Indian solar industry does not mean that it is more diverse. I've worked on projects with cook stoves myself. I ran them at WWF. They do help women to no longer collect wood and instead put their girls in education. They do give women economic empowerment. But the massive transition in renewables that you've seen is being delivered by global multinational companies. And let me tell you, their boardrooms do not look like me. Women are not necessarily being empowered by the energy transition, at least at the energy transition at scale. If we want that, you're going to have to force them. And I suppose that's what I mean when I say hope has to be a tool. You have to actually use it. The last thing I would say is this. We heard a lot about impacts from the other team, and as you know, we agree. The most unequal thing we could do is allow the ravages of climate change to happen across the world. Vulnerable people, vulnerable groups, vulnerable countries will be the most exposed to this. We absolutely should do something about it. It is a moral imperative. There is no question of that. However, all of the conversation to date has been about mitigation. We talked about how difficult it is to do adaptation. It is not happening fast enough. And loss and damage, the correction of the impacts that were caused by an unequal system, and then trying to do something better, that is certainly not a conversation that was happening. And basically all you're saying when you're saying we should solve the impacts is you should make the world marginally, you should correct the bad things we're already doing. That is not an argument for making it better. That is just compensation for the things we've already done wrong. And when I think about my kids, and I think about the limits of that conversation, even if we did everything right, there is still some unfairness here. How do I explain to the people of the Marshall Islands that they're going to lose their country? And what is the compensation for that? Where is the fairness for them? And how do I explain to my daughter that the area that I grew up in will not be the same for her? Where is the compensation for that? Where is the fairness? Thank you.
Well done. That was really good.
Well, thank you so much to our two brilliant teams. I have to say, I thought I kind of knew roughly how everyone was going to argue, but you really surprised me, and I have to say delighted me with some of the arguments. So I think very powerful arguments for the team arguing for the motion. Clearly, it's pretty hard to argue against the fact that, climate change is such a huge threat to global equality. We only have to look at where it lands hardest and who's hit more, and I think you did a great job of setting out just what that impact is in low-income countries, particularly when it comes to agriculture. Obviously, if you've got water stress and high temperatures, then, because these low-income countries are so dependent on agriculture, that's where we're going to feel the pain. Some great points made about why the Millennium Development Goals failed. SDGs, we'll see, but, they didn't. It's pretty widely recognised. They didn't take equality into account as much as many argue that they should. Fundamentally, I think a very, very great job was done by the team. Now, the team speaking against, I will say, also made some really compelling points. We have delivered a huge amount on climate change. We've exceeded expectations when it comes to the deployment of renewables, and yet global inequality has grown. Some great points made about the UNFCCC process, which is appallingly unfair when it comes to the way that middle-income, low-income countries in particular are supposed to negotiate with just a few dozen or less people in their teams versus the 300 or so of the US and others. I think the argument that actually didn't develop as much as you might have, I think, about AOC's argument about, we don't want to go from having oil barons to solar barons. That's a really interesting and live topic in many parts of the world, in the US, in Africa and elsewhere. Great points made on green jobs, and some also, I think the points also made about the climate models, which I am not as going to be as adept at explaining as many people in the room, but I think some of the points you made there aside also were very, very strong when it comes to looking at some of the built-in inequities there. So, some great work done by both teams. We now come to the moment of truth, where we're going to ask you to vote again. By the magic of the audio-visual scene, we will see another picture of the QR code. So, if you point your cameras at that and vote. You'll remember that 78% was the yes vote when we started. I'm going to do this myself. I'm not voting, I'm just looking.
Yeah, I spend my whole time arguing that. Yeah.
Okay, question. Is tackling climate change good for global equality? Lots of tapping. Lots of people looking at how everyone else is voting. Okay, now people looking expectantly at the screen, I believe. Who hasn't voted yet? Any undecided? Whoop, right, one up the back. We're going to let everybody vote here.
52-48.
Technical difficulties? Technical difficulties? Oh, all right. I think that we have probably finished. Okay, my colleagues will, with the magic of AV, put the final result up on the screen, and it is... Oh, really? Okay.
Oh my
Okay, what can I say? I mean, really very interesting. I would just like to say huge thank you to both the teams for doing an absolutely amazing job. Really interesting debate. And thank you for the Smith School for putting it on. I'm going to hand back to Cameron right now. Thanks, Cameron.